The central riddle of civilization is this: how do you get genetically unrelated strangers to cooperate with each other? Now, that seems like a strange question to most Westerners because we just take for granted the fact that you can cooperate with complete strangers. But the only reason why we take this for granted is because we solved this problem in the West about 1,000 years ago in the depths of the Middle Ages. Most of the rest of the world, people live in dense kinship-based networks, and these kinship-based networks do a great job of fostering cooperation within the extended family, but they do a terrible job of promoting trust outside the extended family. So the extended family is a development trap. And I'll give you a quick bit of data to show this. If you want a simple rule of thumb to determine how successful a nation is, just look up its rate of cousin marriage. And cousin marriage is a common trick in extended families because extended families practice primogeniture, which is when the eldest son gets the lion's share of the inheritance. And so that creates a bit of a problem. The youngest son is kind of iced out. And because of that, the youngest son doesn't have any real reason to commit to the extended family. And cousin marriage is one of the tricks used to keep the other siblings as part of the family. So imagine a patriarch of an extended family has two sons. The eldest will get the inheritance. But he also tells both sons, my youngest son's daughter will marry my eldest son's son. And that way the youngest son gets to be a part of the family that way. His children and his grandchildren will inherit the family wealth. So, dense kinship networks promote trust within the family, but they hurt trust outside of the family. So another way of seeing how prepared a society is for modern life and trusting strangers is to go to the World Values Survey and see how different nations answer the question, generally speaking, can other people be trusted? And the answer to this question is very strikingly broken down by cultural group, with historically Protestant nations having the highest trust. And if you get deep into the World Values Survey, they are a promoter of what's called secularization thesis. They attribute these values to secularism, but what's important to recognize is the historical roots. That's where this high level of trust originated. In any case, that's the answer to the problem. The answer to the problem is break down these dense kinship networks in order to promote trust of strangers. And here's the problem. Whenever people can cooperate as a group, it's in their individual self-interest to free ride, to shirk on the job, while everyone else works hard. So, these dense kinship networks and strong extended families can override the incentive to free ride on the efforts that everyone else in the group is making. But they make it even more likely to free ride when you have to cooperate with strangers. That's the problem. So, let's do an economic analysis and see exactly how this dynamic plays out. If you recall from the video Populist Conservatism number 6, the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics is a mathematical proof that markets will reach the most efficient outcome possible, provided that a few assumptions have been met. And what we've also learned is that this is actually a terrible way to defend free markets. The best way to defend free markets is the role that windfall profits create as a short-term windfall for firms that create new products or find innovative ways to make existing products cost a lot less. So in the short term, they make a ton of money. In the long term, competition comes into play and drives the profit margins down to something more reasonable. That's the real reason to defend free markets, not this theoretical mathematical model. But the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics is extremely useful for revealing the hidden assumptions that go into cooperation. And so this video is about the third assumption, the idea that people's preferences and desires can't hurt others, even indirectly. So let's dive into how this assumption is not always true in the real world. Garrett Hardin invented the tragedy of the commons to be a counterexample to the invisible hand. So if you recall, the invisible hand says that the pursuit of self-interest leads to the greater good. And a lot of times it really does. That was the whole running theme through Populist Conservatism number 3 through Populist Conservatism number 5. But in the case of the tragedy of the commons, the pursuit of self-interest promotes the greater bad. So here's one version of the parable. A group of ranchers graze their cattle on a commons. That's public land that everybody is allowed to use. So in order to maintain the long-term health of the grass and to prevent it from becoming overgrazed, the ranchers should follow a quota of perhaps 50 cattle each. The problem is that each rancher has an incentive to break the quota and graze extra cattle. And then the problem gets worse because every single rancher has the exact same incentive. So they all perhaps double the size of their herds to 100 cattle. The outcome is that there are more cows than the common could feed, so the cows become weak and sickly and scrawny due to a lack of grass to eat. Now let's analyze the economic incentives. This may be a little subtle or complicated, but it's key to really everything in the rest of this video series. So if you need to rewind the video a couple times to make sure you get it, it's worth doing that. So, each rancher can either cooperate or defect. If they cooperate, they'll do what's in the group's interest and follow their informal quota of 50 cows. If they defect, they'll do what's in their own self-interest. That means they'll break their quota and graze perhaps 100 cattle on the land. So let's think about this decision from the perspective of a single rancher. We'll call her Alicia. She's trying to decide if she should cooperate or defect. So here's her reasoning. Imagine that all the other ranchers decided to defect. In that case, the land is going to be overgrazed no matter what she does. So if there's tens of thousands of cattle all grazing, then adding 50 versus 100 isn't going to make a difference. So if they're all defecting, the land's going to become overgrazed. And if that's the case, she might as well as graze 100 cattle on the land as well. It's better for her to have 100 scrawny and malnourished cows than 50 scrawny and malnourished cows. Now suppose that the other ranchers decided to cooperate, which means they followed their informal quota of 50 cattle. Well then in that case, her best option is to defect and graze 100 cattle, because now the grass will be very abundant and her adding an extra 50 cattle when there's already maybe 5,000 cattle there isn't going to make a difference. There's still going to be plenty of grass, and so it's better for her to have 100 healthy cows than to have 50 healthy cows. So no matter what everybody does, her best option is to defect. And that's the essence of a Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium means that you can't improve your outcome by making any other choice. And that's exactly what happens in the tragedy of the commons. There's a single Nash equilibrium of defect, and everybody ends out taking that option. And to foreshadow many of the topics that pop up throughout the rest of the video series, there are many situations in life where you have a Nash equilibrium of defect, and so you need what are called pro-social norms to steer people towards choosing to cooperate, even though you're facing a Nash equilibrium where defect is always in your self-interest. And I'll give a very simple example of this. Suppose you work at an office that has a very bad corporate culture. Then everybody's kind of shirking on the job, they're not working very hard, they all leave early, no one's really putting in the work, and so the firm is struggling. You would feel like a sucker if you were the only person who really had a sense of excellence and did their fair share of making the office run and the firm be successful. By contrast, suppose you got sick of it or the firm went out of business, and so you found a new job at a place that really did have a sense of excellence. The employees were respected, and the employees responded to this respect by working hard for the sake of the firm. Then, if someone new from the old firm came in or with that old attitude came in and they weren't doing their fair share, you'd be outraged at them because you'd see very clearly how this one free rider could sink the entire firm if that shirking attitude were to spread. So these pro-social norms become vitally important, and I think they're foundational to the gut instincts that drive most people to become conservative. There's this sense that there are free riders who are not holding up their end of the social contract. And even more importantly, the left, with their long-running attacks on social norms, are actively undermining this implicit, unwritten social contract. And I think that's far more foundational to being a conservative than a belief in free markets or even a belief in, say, monogamy. Now let's circle back to the commons. A lot of libertarians would object that this is a non-problem. The main issue is that the commons are basically communism. Even the names are very similar. Commons, communism. Whenever people publicly own land, you get communism, and then the outcome is going to be very, very bad. And so the solution is private property. Suppose each rancher was given their own individual lot. Then no one's going to graze 100 cattle on a lot that only grows enough grass to feed 50. So in this situation, the invisible hand would reassert itself. Everybody would follow their own self-interest, and the greater good of maximizing the yield of the land would be achieved. The economist Lester Thurow makes this point in the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics. He writes, "Capitalism requires profits, and profits require ownership. Property ownership generates responsibility. A decade ago, I wrote an article about communism entitled, 'Who Stays Up with the Sick Cow?' Without ownership, the answer is often no one, and the cow and communism died." For the most part, I agree with this analysis. If you really get deep into economics, you can find places where commons may be efficiency enhancing. For example, if you know your British history, sometimes the commons became a source of essentially unemployment insurance for people who had fallen on hard times. You could hunt in the commons, you could gather firewood in the commons, things like that. But for the most part, Lester Thurow is absolutely correct. The problem is that not everything can be divided into privately owned lot. So I'll give a few examples. Global warming, poor air quality, endocrine disruptors such as environmental estrogens that lead to early puberty for girls and low testosterone levels for boys, overfishing in the oceans. These are all cases of the tragedy of the commons, but there's no way to solve it with private property. It would be great if we could. Imagine if we could somehow divide the atmosphere into privately owned lots so everybody lived in a bubble of their own personal air supply. Well, then we wouldn't need any regulations to make people want clean air because no one wants to breathe in, for example, their own car's exhaust fumes. So environmental problems are really the easiest way to appreciate the tragedy of the commons. So let's take a look at a classic environmental problem. Suppose Alicia built a factory on a river and Blake lives downstream. Alicia's factory pollutes the river, which damages Blake's property. Economists call this pollution an external cost. Normally, all the costs to make a product are included in the price, but that's not the case of an external cost. So you could think about it this way. Suppose Alicia's widget factory can make a widget for $100, but it also does $10 worth of damage to Blake's property per widget. Then Blake is forced to spend $10 cleaning up for each and every widget that Alicia sells. The standard solution to this problem is for the government to step in with either a tax or a regulation. So suppose Alicia is required to install a special filter that removes the pollution, and the cost of this filter works out to $5 per widget. So she used to sell her widgets for $100, but her cost just went up by $5, so now she can only sell them for $105. But at this point, all the costs are internalized. Blake no longer pays this external cost of $10 per widget. And I won't do the math, but economics defend this not on fairness grounds, that it's unfair for Blake to spend the $10 per widget, but for efficiency grounds. The size of the economic pie is actually larger when the external cost is internalized. But I think most people care more about the fairness of it. And this type of solution can work really well, and I'll use the solved environmental problem as an example. When I was growing up, the big environmental problem was the hole in the ozone layer that was big and getting bigger. And a hole in the ozone layer would result in higher rates of skin cancer and cataracts. So in 1987, 24 nations signed the Montreal Protocol, which limited the use of chlorofluorocarbons, which were used in aerosol sprays. And today the hole is the smallest that it's been in decades, and it's still shrinking. Now, the left spends a lot of time complaining about global warming, but what they don't spend much time talking about is that if the environmental movement had never existed, global warming would be a solved environmental problem. So in 1970, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, was passed, and then a year or two later was the Calvert-Cliffs, appellate court decision about how this law should be enforced. And the effect of these was to basically make building nuclear power plants prohibitively expensive in the United States. And so that essentially just sent our nuclear power plant industry into a screeching halt. So if these environmental acts had never happened, we would have kept building them. And there were other nations that responded to potential risks of nuclear power in very different ways. And some of them have grids that are 60, 70, 80% nuclear power. And we could have done that ourselves if it had not been for these environmental regulations. And so we could have a grid that would be 80% green energy, and unlike solar, you don't have to worry about what to do at night. You don't need this smart grid technology. You don't need batteries. It just would have been the ideal solution, and we can't have that because of the environmental movement. And since I'm talking about nuclear power in a positive way, I should probably quickly forestall some of the rebuttals against it. First is the idea of nuclear waste. Now, waste from nuclear power does take about 100,000 years to go away or to become safe, but that's still a non-problem. You just store it underground in a place that's free of seismic influences, and it's totally fine. And if you don't believe me, I'll give you a good example. There's what's called a natural nuclear reactor in Oklo. I think it's in South Africa. And because of a weird confluence of geological events, there was some underground uranium that went into nuclear fission, and this was billions of years ago. And this was just in waterlogged sandstone or limestone. And billions of years later, that radiation has long since dissipated, but the actual products have only moved a couple of centimeters in billions of years. And that was just a random location. If we stored them in, say, concrete flasks in an underground cave, then that would easily make it for 100,000 years, no problem. The other issue is the risk of a nuclear meltdown, but it's important to realize that no one has died from a nuclear meltdown in the West. So 3 Mile Island happened, no one died. Fukushima happened, no one died. A few people died because of the evacuation, the various stress and difficulties of the evacuation, but no one died from the actual nuclear meltdown itself. And in our Navy, we have, I think, dozens or maybe even hundreds of submarines and ships that use nuclear reactors, and no one has died from them. There have been industrial accidents not related to meltdowns that have caused fatalities, but that's the nature of working in an industrial facility. That sometimes happens. And by the standards of industrial facilities, nuclear reactors are actually pretty safe. You would be much more dangerous working on, say, wind towers than in a nuclear reactor. So the only meltdown that has actually killed people is Chernobyl in the Soviet Union with communist technology. And if you've seen the HBO special, you have a pretty good idea of just how horrific the politics were around it. And even in Soviet Union, that killed, I think, 6,000 people, if you look at the UN estimates on it. And that could go up over time as people get older and become more susceptible to, like, thyroid cancer in particular. But you're still looking at maybe an upper bound of about 20,000 people according to UN estimates. By contrast, even in the United States, we have thousands of people die every year because of energy insecurity. You have elderly people on fixed income who can't run their heat as high as they would like. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of people every year who die because of poor air quality from burning fossil fuels. So even if we go with Soviet-level technology, it's still much safer than the alternatives. And finally, it's worth pointing out that both 3 Mile Island and Fukushima used what is called second-generation nuclear reactors. Third-generation nuclear reactors are significantly safer than those, and fourth-generation reactors are starting to be developed that are even safer still. Now let's switch gears a little bit and look at another type of tragedy of the commons, and that's what are called public goods. Public goods are a type of good that can only be built by the government. Rockets are not a public good, but for some reason the government builds rockets anyways. So that's very cool. We can't compare the cost of, say, a government-built car to a free market car, but we can compare the cost of a government rocket to a free market rocket. And so the SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket costs about $1,500 per kilogram to launch a payload into space. But by contrast, NASA's SLS rocket costs about $43,000 per kilogram to launch payload into space. So that means SpaceX is about 30 times more affordable. Now leftists can yes-but this in various ways, but all this yet-butting does is highlights how inflexible and rigid government processes are compared to the dynamism and flexibility of free market firms. So already the major takeaway should be, if the free market can possibly build something, let the free market build it, don't let the government build it. And national defense is a perfect example. So we have private firms build tanks and planes on a cost-plus basis, but they can't actually provide the service of national defense. Assume, hypothetically, that a private company called Defendtech sold the service of national defense, and Alicia signs up for it, but her neighbor Blake does not. And then Canada invades the United States, probably to get back at Americans after that whole Blame Canada episode. And so Defendtech unleashes a bunch of tanks and fighter jets and infantry, and they drive the warmongering Canadians away. The problem is that Blake is just as safe and liberated as Alicia, even though Blake didn't actually pay for national defense. So national defense is what economists would say is a non-excludable good. There's no way to stop people who didn't buy it from benefiting from the service. And if you think it through, the incentives are exactly the same as the tragedy of the commons. People can either pay for national defense, cooperate, or save their money, defect. If everyone else cooperates, then you can defect and free ride on the national defense that everyone else paid for. But if everyone else defects, then you'd be a sucker to be the only one cooperating. Your piddly $5,000, which is what the average taxpayer spent for national defense in 2022, isn't going to buy many tanks or fighter jets. So just like the tragedy of the commons, the provision of public goods has a single Nash equilibrium, and that equilibrium is to always defect. And once again, the standard solution is to use the government, which is why governments provide national defense and not free market firms. Another way of framing this kind of analysis is that the people who choose to defect are what are called free riders. They free ride on the efforts that everyone else puts in. And the best way to think about these kind of Nash equilibriums is through the lens of free riders. So society as a whole benefits if everyone cooperates and does the right thing, but it's very tempting for some people to have their cake and eat it too. In other words, to free ride on the efforts of the rest of the group. Roads and railroads are another type of public good, just like the military. So suppose Alicia planned to build a railroad from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and she starts buying up land along her proposed route. Unfortunately for her, Blake's house lies right along her route, and he refuses to sell unless she pays him $10 million. And even in California, houses in the remote desert are not worth $10 million, or at least I don't think they are. And there are a lot more holdouts just like Blake along her route, so if she tries to meet the demands of the holdout, then her project is essentially sunk. Now, in theory, options on land could help. So you buy the option on land, which means you pay a small fraction of the property's value for the right to buy the property later at a predetermined rate. And that allows her a lot more flexibility. Instead of buying land upon one route, she can buy land upon a very wide strip using options. And then as soon as she is able to connect the dots in a way that allows her to build her route, then she goes and purchases that option from the people. But options only reduce the holdout problem. They don't eliminate it. And so this is why the standard solution to building roads and railroads is the government, because it can use the power of eminent domain. And that means the government forces Blake to sell his home at a fair market value price. Now, in theory, eminent domain should only be used for true public goods, like building roads or railroads, but in the very notorious Kelo versus New London Supreme Court case, a legal precedent was set in which the local government used eminent domain to force some people to sell to a private developer. And the justification for it was that the private developer would improve the land, and this would raise more tax money for the town. So that's a terrible precedent that you would use eminent domain for the sake of a private good. At the time, the left had a liberal majority on the Supreme Court. They had a 5-4 majority, and the vote was 5-4 upon party lines. So maybe now that there's a conservative majority, the Kelo decision can be overturned. So now let's think about the decay and decadence in the United States today. So in the 1800s, the United States built about 200,000 miles of railroad using hand tools. We didn't have bulldozers or any modern internal combustion engines. We didn't have specialized railroad building trucks like ballast tampers. We just had to use pickaxes and sledgehammers to build railroads, and yet we built 200,000 miles of it. In 2008, the state of California set out to build a railroad that connected San Francisco to Los Angeles, and the price tag was what seemed like an astronomical $33 billion. 15 years later, and that price tag has ballooned to $113 billion, and yet construction has only recently begun on a short starter segment in the middle of the desert. So even with the benefit of eminent domain, the project has been bogged down over land use and environmental regulations. So if the government with the benefit of eminent domain can't build anything, then private developers have no hope at all. So how did we get to this situation, and what's the solution? So to answer that, I'm going to turn to the leftist Ezra Klein. And Ezra Klein is often considered this policy wonk and technocrat, but he's far enough to the left that in 2020 he published the book Why We're Polarized. And the central thesis of this book is that conservatives are irretrievably racist because they did not go along with recreating all of our Enlightenment institutions into critical theory and postmodernist institutions that rejected the concept of objective truth and individual rights in favor of group-based power plays. And yet, even someone as far to the left as Ezra Klein can see the problems that the left has created. His basic thesis is that environmental regulations have too many veto points. There's too many people who don't really even have a stake in the project who can veto the success of it. I would put it this way. Under our criminal justice system, you're innocent until proven guilty. But if you actually want to build something, you're guilty until proven innocent. And people can raise all sorts of charges, and you have to prove your innocence against every single charge. Is there a bird, an endangered species of bird, that flies over your property twice a year? Well, now you have to prove that you're not going to harm them. Oh, there's another species of bird. Now you have to prove that you're not going to harm that other species of bird. And what about water? Now you have to prove that you're not going to damage the water. And what about sightlines and traffic? Now you have to prove that there's no major harm from sightlines and traffic. And this can go on for years or decades, and often sinks the cost of a project. And even if it does succeed, this long legal process means that many projects are abandoned before they even begin because they know they could never survive it. In one article, Ezra Klein writes, "I ran this argument by Zarensky, a construction industry insider. As I finished, he told me that I couldn't see it over the phone, but he was nodding his head up and down enthusiastically. There are so many people who want to have some say over a project," he said. "You have to meet so many parking spaces per unit. It needs to be this far from the sight lines. You can't use this much reclaimed water. You didn't have 30 people sitting in a hearing room for the approval of a permit 40 years ago." So the old understanding was, it's my land, I can do what I want with it. But concepts like the tragedy of the commons made us realize that there are other stakeholders who might actually be impacted by the choices you make. The classic example again, Alicia's factory that pollutes the river. You don't have the right to pollute river that impacts someone else's land. But we've taken this so far now that it's easy to come up with some theoretical justification like sight lines and use of reclaimed water. The Cape Wind project was a proposed offshore wind farm near the island of Nantucket, and Nantucket is where all the wealthy Massachusetts liberals live. So despite their idea that the environment should be protected, they didn't want it to ruin their beautiful views. So they fought a 16-year battle against Cape Wind and ultimately won. The US government fast-tracked the Sunzia wind farm, and it still took 17 years to get a permit. And of course, it's worth pointing out that the light rail system in California was not primarily to make it easier to get back and forth between San Francisco and Los Angeles, but to protect the environment by giving a low-emissions rail solution for transportation. And they can't do that because of environmental regulations. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not arguing for the abolition of all environmental regulations. So, regulations like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act are good things, but the idea that a firm that wants to build something is considered guilty until proven innocent, and they'll spend 20 years facing environmental lawsuits before they can get a permit, is destructive. 1970 was really the inflection point, and we need to get back to a pre-1970 regulatory burden. So there's probably about an 80-20 rule with regard to regulations. Let's keep the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, but let's get rid of all these nuisance regulations that are just crippling our ability to build. So that wraps up this video. In the next video, we're going to look at the concept of private information. And that's a problem that runs very deep, and it goes hand in hand with the concept of the tragedy of the commons. And we'll also look at how costly signals can at least partially overcome the problem of private information, but they also create new problems when perception becomes more important than reality.